Hi there. I'm happy to be giving this talk for Resolve of New England. Several years ago, I was talking to an old friend who's a child psychiatrist and told her that I was starting to meet more and more families, more and more parents who were building their families through donor conception. And I asked her if she had any advice for me and for them. And without missing a beat, she said, the parents need to love the story and the child needs to know that their parents love the story. This is the focus of my talk today, how you as parents and future parents can love the story of your child's creation and be able to tell it to that story to your child with pride and confidence. There's a quote that I love from the author, Joshua Gamson, who is a donor father, a sociologist, and he writes in his book, Modern Families, stories help us make sense. They put things in order. This is how it happened. They're the stuff of which identities are built. Creation stories in particular are about selfhood. So how do you love a story that has involved, at least for many of you, loss and frustration, and that most awful of feelings, regret? It must feel like a tall order. I encourage you to see the story as it exists so far as a past chapter in your life, and that what will unfold in the future is a different time and a different experience. And as you look back, it's hard not to look back on the chapters that have come before, again, without feelings of loss and wondering how can we move forward and feel really good about the story. And I'm always reminded of a client years ago who was really struggling with the decision of whether to go ahead with egg donation, and decided to take her sadness and her cares to Ocean's Edge. And she went to a beach and stood at the Ocean's Edge, and was casting her sadness and her loss out to sea. What she never anticipated was what the waves would bring in. And what she described was what the waves brought into her was the reassurance that the child that she longed for was going to come to her in a different way, but that she was in fact going to get the child that she'd been longing for so long. And she did. But a few years later, when a hysterectomy meant that she couldn't carry her second child, she returned to Ocean's Edge, hoping to again have her hopes and dreams renewed. And they were, and she went on to have two long-awaited daughters. So as you look back on the sadness you've experienced, I think it's important to remind yourself that your story is not your child's story. Yes, your story, the chapters that have come before, do involve, again, in many instances, sadness, loss, frustration, regret. But that's not the story that your child comes into the world with. Children aren't born assuming that they'll have a mom and a dad to whom they're genetically related to. If they come into the world and they have one mom or one dad, or two moms or two dads, or one donor or two donors, that's their story. And again, it gets back to my friend's advice. The parents need to love the story, and the child needs to know that their parents love the story. So from the child's perspective, I think that that's pretty easy. This is my story. And I was deeply wanted and longed for, and my birth is celebrated. But again, it often takes some work on parents' part to feel that you too love the story. There was a time not all that long ago when many doctors and some well-respected mental health professionals told people not to tell their children that they were donor conceived. Makes no sense to me. What I always say to people, what they did was they took a beautiful thing and made a problem of it, because in telling people not to tell, they were creating this sense of shame and secrecy, and that there was something wrong. I think we have to thank lesbian couples, gay couples, single moms by choice, in large part for taking donor conception out of the closet and helping it make its way into the sunlight. Because I think we're in a very, very different place now. Just recently, I was in a local deli, and it's a very small space, and it was crowded that day. And I had my mask on, and I was thinking about COVID, not donor conception. I feel a tap on my shoulder from another masked woman. So fortunately, I didn't recognize her. I could say it was because of the mask. And she said, "Are you Ellen? I was in your support group for donor egg moms 15 years ago." And she said, "I can date it because that's how old my daughter is." And it was great. She's great. The donor was great. We're still in touch with the donor. And this is all occurring in this crowded deli for everyone to hear. So I'm not suggesting by any means that everybody is as open and as inclined to sharing as this woman was. But I think that the story really does illustrate that things are very different. Years ago, I would give a talk several years in a row for this conference where I spoke with people who were deciding between egg donation and adoption. And I would assemble a panel of parents. It was always really easy to find adoptive parents who were happy to tell their story. But when it came to finding people who had built their families through egg donation, it was really hard. There was usually just like really one person, I can think of it right now, who'd be willing to talk, and everybody else was quite private or secretive about it. And so one of the things I'll talk in this talk is about distinguishing privacy from secrecy, because I think there is a lot to be said for privacy, but there was a time when this was treated with great secrecy. So I'm starting from the perspective that if you become or you are a parent through donor conception, that you will be having conversations with your child. How can you best ensure that those conversations go well? I think there are three things that need to be in place right from the get-go before you proceed with building a family through an egg donor, sperm donor, an embryo donor. And the three things are, if you have a partner, if you're not doing this alone, if you have a partner, that you and your partner are very much on the same page. The second thing is that you have to choose your donor really well. The child needs to know that the parents love the story. And for the parents to love the story, you have to love the donor. And then finally, to be on the same page, again, if you have a partner, vis-a-vis privacy and secrecy. So the first part, I think, is the tallest order. How does a couple come to reckon with having a child that is going to be genetically connected to one of them and not the other? Now, I don't want to assume that that's always the case in donor conception. You may not be in a couple. You may be becoming a single parent. If you're in a couple, it's possible that you will choose embryo donation. There may be two donors, but most often people are making a decision to have a child where one person gets to have that genetic connection and the other does not. So I also want to make a distinction between sperm donation and egg donation, because I think they're different. With egg donation, while the mom doesn't get to have a genetic connection with her child, there is that gestational connection. And I will always remember one mom from egg donation many years ago. She may have been the first person I knew who had a child through egg donation. And what she said at the time, and she had had an older child that was her genetic child, and then she had twins through egg donation. And I very foolishly said to her, do you love them any different? Stupid thing to say. And she looked at me like I had four heads, which she should have. And she said, no, she said, I grew their hearts the same way. I grew their brains the same way. I don't feel any different. So a pregnancy really underscores one's authenticity as a parent, one's physical connection to a child. So it is a different experience than sperm donation, where the dad is physically on the sidelines. The mom gets to have both the genetic and the gestational connection, and he does not. So I'm saying all this because I think that there need to be serious conversations. What do we each and what do we both think about all this? What do genetic connections mean to us? How important is it to you as an individual or to your partner to be able to pass genes on? What might it feel like to know that your partner has a genetic connection? and you do not. And I don't want to also make that sound like that's all a negative, because what many people would say is, I married him, or I'm with him, or I'm with her because I wanted his baby or I wanted her baby. And my partner having the genetic connection is really important to me. Lesbian couples struggle with this in a different way. I'm meeting more and more lesbian couples becoming parents together, and I'm meeting people with all different perspectives. Some, in some instances, one partner doesn't care about genetic connection, the other wants it very much. In some instances, one partner doesn't want to be pregnant, but cares about a genetic connection, and they may make a decision to do reciprocal IVF. In some couples, they both want the genetic connection and they both want to be pregnant, and they just keep their fingers crossed that it's going to work out for both of them. But any way you look at it, there's a need for some serious conversations and for a couple to really feel rock solid that if we're going to move ahead with this, we're okay with what might feel like a genetic imbalance. But assuming you get there and are at a point of picking a donor, there are decisions to be made about who's the donor. Because again, it gets back to my friend's advice. The parents need to love the story so that the child can love the story, and the parents, I would add, need to love the donor. So there are some instances where you do love the donor. The donor is your sister or your brother as a sperm donor. But what I found, or a close friend, but what I found more often than not is that people who have a donor in their life, whom they love, who is ready, willing, and able to donate, are really few and far between. So you may have a very willing and ready sister who'd love to donate her eggs to you, but she is 42 and can't. Your brother may want to donate sperm to you, but his wife is terribly upset by the idea. So for one reason or another, I find that most people find their way to egg banks, egg agencies. Now there's this new program, co-fertility, sperm banks, and you're in a position of looking for someone who is a stranger to become a small branch on your family tree, and hopefully to be able to graft that branch, feeling like that's just going to make the tree bloom all the more. So how do you pick a donor? I begin by always putting in a strong plug for an open donor. And open can mean different things. With a sperm donor, open almost always means someone who says, I'm willing to be found when the child's 18. With egg donation, it can mean a lot more. You may have the opportunity to meet the donor in advance and have a real sense, a firsthand sense of who she is. And another one of my favorite stories, which goes back now 17 years ago, and I can't remember what I did yesterday, but I can remember exactly where I was when this client called, and she hadn't been at all happy about egg donation, but she had met her donor and called me and said, she's great, she's wonderful, I love her, I don't want my own eggs anymore, I just want her eggs. Well, did she want her own eggs? I'm sure she would have liked them, but was she really, truly thrilled with this donor then and remains so? She was. So when there's the opportunity to meet the donor, I've never seen it go bad. I've only seen people feel really grateful that they have this connection. But so often what you find from it, learn about a donor, is what you find on paper and through audio recordings and pictures and so forth. And they can tell a lot and go a long way to your feeling, yes, this is the right person to help us expand our family. So what are some of the other things that people look for in a donor? Ethnicity. Ethnicity is of great importance to some people and of minimal or no importance to others. I've found that Italians Greeks love their heritage, want to be able to pass that heritage on to others. I've heard people say, I'm Italian, no matter whether I'm genetically connected to the child or not. This is child is going to be Italian, born to an Italian mother, where others will feel that having that shared ethnicity is really important. I remember a woman who was Irish Catholic, married to a Jewish husband, and they had agreed to raise their children Jewish. And she said, on one condition, the donor has to be Irish Catholic. I need my heritage reflected. There are other people who say, I'm a mutt. I like being a mutt. So that's fine. I don't care what the donor's ethnicity is. Again, I don't think there's a right or wrong. It's what's right for you. Height matters. I find again and again that tall people want tall donors, and short people often want to add a few inches. We never know. Our kids are surprises. We never know who they're going to be and how they're going to turn out and what they're going to be like. But height is often very, genetically determined. People will also look at mental health history, another thing that can be heavily genetically determined, and really want to avoid it. And there's some instances where people say, I didn't really seek donor conception, but this is a good thing. There's addictions in my family, and I can find a donor that doesn't have a history of addictions. So people pay a lot of attention to mental health history, and to the extent that there's physical issues in the parent the person who's going to be the genetic parent. So if you are, if the man has the BRCA gene, which men can have, then it may be much more important to be sure that the donor doesn't have a history of breast cancer in her family. So people pay attention to family genetic health history, again, looking to not overweight a particular condition. Interests, do we have shared interests? And again, our kids are a surprise. Two athletic people can have a child that never gets off the couch. But it's really nice to start out with hopes and expectations. So if you are athletic, your partner's athletic, and you choose an athletic donor, you may get a couch potato, but you won't look back and say, it's because it's not for want of trying. An artistic donor, a musical donor, I remember someone who said, we have no musical ability in our family, and my donor has perfect pitch. So I call that the donor add-on, where the donor brings something to the family that you hadn't anticipated, but is a blessing. But at the end of the day, what I found again and again is, and this gets back to the sense that people love the donor. And that is that people come to a place where they find someone that they feel they just really like. They like their answers about how they feel about their family, about their goals. They like their sense of humor. They have a genuine sense that if I met this person, this is somebody that I would really like. And I think that sets the stage for people being able to tell the story with pride, confidence, and joyfulness. Finally, before moving forward, I think it's important that partners be on the same page about what's private and what's secret. From my perspective, there are only a very few people who have an absolute right to know that your child is donor conceived. Your child, any future children, any other children in the family, the obstetrician, the pediatrician, any other medical caregivers for whom genetics might be relevant, and everybody else is optional. Now you might say, but what about our family? What about our parents and our sisters and our nieces and nephews? They should know. And I agree with that. But the question is, when do you want to tell them? Do you want to tell them in advance? If you do, I really encourage you not to tell them any details, because you don't know how it will go. This could take a very short time, or it could take a long time. And it's hard. And I think people who've been through infertility already know this, that having a lot of onlookers cheering you on can be a difficult thing. But assuming that you will tell your family at some point, some people want to wait till after a child is born and let that child be welcomed in the family with no backstory, or no backstory that everybody knows at this point. Some people feel like it's the child's information and wait till the child brings it up and is old enough to talk about it, and then you tell the family. I don't think there's a right or wrong on this, but it is essential that a couple be on the same page so that you don't ever discover that your partner says, well, I just told my sister, I just couldn't help it. I had to tell my sister. What many people do is to pick a few people in their life that they want to tell, and bring them into the circle. And then there are other people, and the woman that I talked about in the deli may have been one of them, that they simply tell everybody. And that's fine if that's your choice, but it is indeed a choice. So now, assuming that the stage is set for you to be able to tell the story, feeling confident, what are the next steps? How do you decide how and when to tell your child? And there's a prevailing school of thought that I subscribe to, and I think that most people I encounter do, that it's a good thing for a child to grow up always knowing. When you talk with teenagers or young adults who are donor conceived, they bring it up again and again. It was really important to them to always know. And they say the same thing. Each of them says the same thing. I always knew, it was never a big deal. But I've met people that didn't know, and I'm really, really grateful to my parents that they told me right from the start. But before I go into this idea of always knowing, which again, I subscribe to, I want to acknowledge that there are some people who think that there is a perfect age, that they want to tell their child, a right age. And I met somebody at a social event not that long ago where we were talking about her son, who's in his 30s now, and he is the light of their life. And she pulled out a family picture, and there I find this tall, handsome young man flanked by two short parents. So stupid me says to her, without thinking 1 second, how did two short people like you get a tall son? To which she quickly says, we picked a tall sperm donor. So I thought she was joking because she knew the kind of work I do. She said she wasn't. She says, it's not a secret. I just, anybody who wants to know, that it's been great. He's been great. We've had a great experience. We told him we decided 12 was the perfect age to tell him. And so we told him when he was 12, and it went great. Well, I think I would caution telling a child at 12. To me, it seems perilously close to adolescence, which wouldn't be a good time. And I think more significantly, a lot can happen that could get in the way of telling at 12. There can be illness in a family, it can be divorce, death, the child may be being bullied at school. There may be all kinds of things that get you to age 12, if that's the number you choose. And then it's not the right time. And those are the families that are really burdened. And one of the saddest stories that I've encountered was just a year or so ago, where a woman called me and said that she had two young adult children in their 20s. And one of them had a 23andMe kit that she was about to use. And she was going to discover that she was donor conceived. This mom had never told her children. And the reason was because when they were really young, her husband became ill, and it was sperm donation. He became ill and he subsequently died. And she had two young children, like ages 4 and 6. And the family was a mess. She needed to get on her feet. This was not a time that she could begin to think of telling them. And then time marched on, and before she knew it, they were teenagers, and it wasn't the right time, and it never became the right time. And then here was this woman who had raised 2 kids on her own, who had really been through a tough time, who now was just overcome with fear and guilt of what was going to come out when she told her children the truth about their origins. A word of reassurance. I've encountered a number of people who did not tell their children, again, often because they were advised not to. And they've been in a panic state, but it's still gone well. Regardless of what the story was, it still worked out okay. I do remember one woman who said, I went from keeping a secret for 15 years to telling my teenager, and then finding that everybody, I'm making up the name of the town, everybody in the town of Framingham knew. My daughter said, I always just felt like an ordinary high school student in Framingham, and now I'm special. So for lots of reasons, I think it's better for a child to grow up always knowing. But what does always knowing mean? Some people will say, will advise that you just start talking when the child is a baby, or even when the child is in utero, talking to the child before they're born. I don't like this, and I don't like it for a couple of reasons. I think one, they will say that, and they will say it gives you a chance to practice. And I think that word practice suggests that there's something to be worried about. You've got to practice the speech, rather than to think about conversations that will be fine, that there's nothing to practice. And I'll get to my own experience having some of those conversations, because I'm now speaking with some firsthand knowledge, I think. So one is I don't like the practicing, because it sets something up that it is that there's something to worry about. The second reason that I really don't like it is that it means you're doing the practicing at a time when you're really vulnerable, that young new parents, it's really hard being a new parent. However your child comes to you, it's hard. And it's hard not to feel inept and like you don't know what you're doing and you're a failure. And I don't think this is the time to be focused on what you've been through, but more a focus on this on-the-job training of beginning to feel confident as a parent. And again, I'm making no distinction at all between a child that's donor conceived and a child that just is spontaneously conceived and you have an easy pregnancy. Most people feel pretty inept. And then finally, I don't think it makes sense to talk to a newborn or a child in utero, because they can't begin. There's no benefit to them. And when I said I have some personal experience, I say that because I have two young grandchildren who are both born to surrogates, two different surrogates. One is 2.5 and one is 5.5. So my 2.5-year-old granddaughter, while she has a lot to say and seems like a really bright child, would absolutely have no idea whatsoever if I started talking to her about surrogacy. She has no clue about any of this. It would be completely lost to her. Does it come up in any way? It does, only because there'll be times when she is at her most adorableness, and I will decide to I'll take my camera out and take a video, and often I will address it to Patty, who is her surrogate. So I'll say, "Hi, Patty, this is Edie. Edie, want to say hi to Patty?" Edie has no idea what I'm talking about. She has heard Patty's name, but I have to say that I don't do it with an agenda to introduce surrogacy. I just do it because it happens spontaneously. And I think that the best conversations do happen spontaneously. Edie's 5.5-year-old brother, Wiley, is at a point where I think he can begin to understand this. So in looking at what's an age to start telling so that the child will always know, from my perspective, 4 is more than safe. I don't think anything could have begun to register with Wiley at 4. I don't know that anything is registering at 5.5, but what I do know is that he loves his birthday. He loves his birthday, and I love the story of the day he was born. And so that's how it comes up. And so he'll bring up his birthday, and I will just launch into the story about how his mom and I were sitting on a park bench in Concord, New Hampshire, and the phone rang, and Sarah, his surrogate, told us that Wiley was coming. And then what just happens is I say, so joy just started coming from everywhere. There was just joy raining all around me, and I couldn't even remember my name. I couldn't remember my phone number. I didn't know how I was going to drive home. This is all true. And I say that because I think that the more authentic the story is, here's a situation where I love the story. There's no way that Wiley is not picking up on my loving the story. Does he have any understanding of where babies come from? He doesn't. So to just say a few more things about actually telling the story. I think that one of the things that I hadn't thought about till I listened to some panel discussions from donor conceived young adults was how important it is to them to know that their parents are rock solid, confident that they're the parents. They really appreciate this. And I'm reminded of a woman who was adopted that I spoke with years ago. And she said, I always felt loved, but I never felt owned. And I remember that stayed in my mind because I thought, well, we're not supposed to own our children, but there is something about that sense of healthy ownership that is really comforting to a child. And so when listening to the donor conceived young adults, they said two things. It was important to them to always know, and it was important for them to always know that their parent was the parent. Some other things that I think are helpful in anticipating conversations with your child is to think about language. What are you going to call the donor? I don't love the word donor. Donor families will say, if you use the donor, say our donor, not your donor or my donor, but our donor. I prefer a name. If you're fortunate enough to have the donor's name, I'd use a first name. I certainly don't like the nice lady or the nice man. So I do recommend if either saying our donor or having a name if you can, or a nickname. So not using some real name that's not the person's name, but calling the donor Lucky or Happy or Skip or Chip or whatever. And later the child can say, so his name's really Lucky. No, but that's how we felt when we found them. We felt so lucky. What would you like to call them from this point on? But thinking about language, because it's very powerful. I would certainly stay away from genetic my mom, genetic dad. I think they have no place in the discussion. Props, books. I think books are the most popular prop that people like. And there are books that are written specifically for donor conceived children. I find that most of them feel very amateurish to me, that they're often written by people who had a child through donor conception, and now they think it qualifies them to be a children's author. And being a children's literature is such a gift. One of my favorite books, which I have right here in case you don't remember it from your childhood, is The Runaway Bunny, where the bunny keeps saying, I'm going to run away. And the mother bunny has every reason to say, then if you do this, then I'm going to do this. And the message again and again and again is, you are my child, no matter what happens, no matter what you do, no matter where you go, no matter who you are my child. So that's kind of one of my favorite donor conception books, even though that's not how it was written. Another favorite is What Makes a Baby, which is appropriate for all children, but I think especially helpful for donor conceived children, because it just in a very matter-of-fact way says, to make a baby, you need eggs, sperm, and a uterus. Some bodies have eggs, some don't. Some bodies have sperm, some don't. Some bodies have a uterus, some don't. There's a lovely series through the Donor Conception Network in the UK, the Our Story series. I counted, I think there's 18 versions. So there's the Our Story if you're two moms with an anonymous donor and twins. There's an Our Story if you're two moms with an egg donor and a sperm donor and a singleton baby. So they try to cover every base and every variation. And then they have other books for children who are a little bit older. The Archie Nolan Family Detective series are really good as well. Some people like to create their own book. And that should be reserved only for those of you who really like to do this. You, as becoming a parent or as a parent, you've got enough on your plate. You don't need to be writing a children's book or creating a scrapbook or whatever. But some people, again, love to have these mementos of their story because it really gives them an opportunity to tap into joy. I get to tap into joy with my grandson, Wiley. Whenever I'm in his room and he's got all his stuffed animals, He's got one little moose that says New Hampshire on it that I happened to pick up at a rest stop when I was going up to New Hampshire, anticipating his birth. And so if we're in the midst of his stuffed animals and the moose is there, then it's, again, just a natural segue into my referring to the joyful time when he was born. A couple of other things. Don't overtalk. You don't have to tell the story over and over and over again to make sure it sinks in. The child will take in the information and they'll ask questions, and the questions will change. So don't overtalk it. You don't have to have all the answers. One of my favorite stories was a client who was a child psychiatrist, and her daughter said to her, when she was 4, her daughter was adopted. I want to go see my birth mother. And her mother said, well, we can't. And her daughter said, why? And she said, because we don't have the money. And then her daughter at 4 said, well, if we don't have the money, how do we go to Turks and Caicos last week? So then the daughter asks again, and the mother comes up with another nonsensical answer. And it keeps happening until finally the mother says, I don't know. And that was the answer that worked. So you don't have to have the right answer. You can make mistakes. I once spoke with a woman who had 3 teenagers who had all been born to there've been egg donors, sperm donors, and surrogates. She's a single mom, and she never told any of them. She had stories for each of them. The youngest, she told she was adopted from Russia. I don't know how she came up with this story, but even then, when she told the kids, after making lots of mistakes along the way, it worked out. So don't worry about getting the story right. Don't worry about making mistakes, and don't worry about tough conversations. There are tough conversations, and the author Bruce Feiler wrote an article in the New York Times in March 2013 called "The Stories That Bind Us," and what he talks about in that is how important it is for self-confidence and identity for a teenager to know their family story, to know where their grandparents met, where their parents grew up, all sorts of family stories. But what he talks about also is what he calls the oscillating narrative, the family story that's not all good. You know, that your story of building your family has not been all positive. But he talks about how there are family stories where it's all good. We came on a boat from Italy. We had a small apartment. We opened a pizza shop. And in 5 years, we had a chain of 50 pizza stores, and we lived in a castle on a private island. And then the other story is we came on the boat from Italy. We got an apartment. We opened a pizza store, and it burned down, and we were evicted from our apartment, and we were homeless, and we never got on our feet again. And then there's the oscillating narrative. We came off the boat from Italy. We opened the pizza store. There was a fire. It was tough getting it started again. We worked hard. Then we had a robbery, but it's worked out, and our pizza store and 3 others are thriving. A couple of other things. I think there's something to be said for having a safe deposit box. Being able to put all the information that you really don't want to be lost or destroyed in any way in a safe place outside the home. And not only does it protect you from fire and floods and a child coming upon this inadvertently or looking for it, but it also gives you some space during these conversations. So if the child says, well, can I see a picture of my donor? And you don't feel quite ready, you can say, you absolutely can. I keep it in a very special place at the bank in our safe deposit box, and we can go and see it. We can't go today, but we can go anytime you want. And then you see what happens. And if you have a child who keeps asking, then of course you take them and show them whatever you have, whatever you can share. But it may very well be that the next day your child is completely focused on something else, because they've got whatever age they are, they got a lot on their minds that has absolutely nothing to do with donor conception. And so I think the final thing I want to say is expect to enjoy telling the story. There are so many tough stories, so many tough conversations that parents have to have in the world we live in. Um, School shootings, racism, bullying, internet safety, it goes on and on. So I just encourage you to see this as your child's very precious, tender, wonderful story that you are able to tell with joy. So without my talking anymore, I thought that the best place to end was to hear the words directly from a donor conceived teen, because I think that actually don't even know if it's a he or she, but he or she has a lot more to say than I do. So I'm gonna end with this. I have known I was donor conceived for as long as I can remember. I think I was told when I was born, and my parents gave me more details as I got older. Whenever I could understand that what the word donor meant, I can't remember the exact age I was told, and that's kind of the point. I know of so many stories when donor conceived kids have vivid memories of when their parents told them. Sometimes their parents didn't even tell them at all, and they had to find out through a DNA test or from another family member letting it slip. I've never had that problem. Being donor conceived has been such a non-issue in my life that it doesn't even factor into how I think about myself. It's not a large part of my identity. I understand that some people might be more attached to their genetic lineage or might have some deeper connection to their donor. I never have. I've known my donor for almost a decade, and we're basically just friends. There's nothing weird about it, and we never talk about egg donation. Some people have asked me, what do you think about being donor conceived? I don't think about it. It's never been that big a deal for me because I've known about it my whole life. My parents are my parents, and my donor is my donor. I've lived with my parents my whole life, and they've raised me and they love me. Wouldn't it be strange if I felt any maternal feelings towards my donor? She feels more like a sibling to me than anything. I do remember that I wanted to know what my donor was like when I was younger. I wanted to know if she was nice, what her name was, and how tall she was. I had a vague feeling that she was important, but I was mostly curious because I just didn't know. The fact that I knew I was donor conceived but didn't know who my donor was had made me a little uncomfortable. I met my donor when I was 11, and now we hang out semi-regularly. Now that I know who she is, it's not a big deal anymore. Honestly, this is the most I've ever thought about egg donation in a while. I can't emphasize enough how much of a non-issue it is in my life. I wouldn't say it's shaped me or changed me, how I think about myself in any way. It's just a different circumstance that led to my birth. Getting upset about being donor conceived makes as much sense to me as being concerned about exactly what shirt my mother wore when she gave birth to me. Doesn't matter. I'm alive all the same. I can only imagine what it'd have been like had my parents not told me early. If I had to find out when I was 18, or if I learned it from someone else in the family, I would probably feel differently about it. Just like adoption, the worst thing you could do to a child is to keep their origins a secret. It doesn't matter to me because I've known my whole life, and I have better things to think about. I can completely understand, though, how a child might feel betrayed or deceived if their origins were kept a secret. To all parents who are worried about telling you their kids, don't be. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. If you tell your kids early and often, they most likely will not care by the time they grow up. There are so many other things that are so much more important to them that they probably won't even care. The worst thing you could do is to keep a secret. Every child deserves to know where they came from. So I will end there. I think it's wise words.